Welcome back to the channel. I want to talk about science itself, the institution of science, and why I think it's quite vulnerable. I got thinking about this week when the New England Journal of Medicine published a blockbuster paper. It's the paper that claims to prove that removing mask mandates in Massachusetts schools over the last school year was followed by an increase in COVID-19 spread. First of all, I gotta say, there's a lot of problems with this paper. But even before we get to those problems, we have to acknowledge that even if it were true that masking school children back last year was associated with a slowing of the COVID-19 spread, that question is over these days. 90+% of kids have had and recovered from COVID-19, and they're going to get it again a few years from now. We won't be able to mask them for the rest of their lives. They're going to have to all get COVID-19. It's just the way the world is. That's the nature of an endemic respiratory virus. And so whatever this study claimed to prove, it's not relevant for future policy considerations. People say, well, RSV is spreading. Well, flu is spreading. Well, this paper doesn't look at RSV and it doesn't look at flu. And in fact, the pre-existing body of evidence suggested that masking was rather ineffective for those two things. The paper has other problems. It relies on an analytic technique called difference in difference, which assumes that there are no time-varying confounders that enter the picture and then leave the picture. But the truth about masking, like so many other policy interventions about COVID-19, is that other things change along with mask policies. There are time-varying confounders, and Tracy Beth Hogg goes through this paper on the Substack Sensible Medicine and has a lengthy rebuttal and finds many clues in the paper that suggest their own analysis is likely incorrect. I encourage you all to subscribe to Sensible Medicine, to read the Sensible Medicine post if you want to get into the weeds on this paper. I don't want to talk about this paper on this channel because it's quite technical, it's going to bore you, and also it's not where my mind is at. My mind is at on a broader question about science and what we're doing. And what got me thinking about that was that this observational study was done by a team who has repeatedly tweeted and said, #mask those kids, mask them, mask them, mask them. Someone said that they'd even started a change.org petition to mask school kids. There are other groups of people who strongly believe you shouldn't mask school kids. We call them the WHO and UNICEF. They say don't do it under 6 and do it sparingly under 12. A lot of scientists in the United Kingdom don't want to do it at all, certainly not for kids under the age of 12. There are differences of opinion, and there are some people who think that masks just don't work at all. I have no doubt that they can all come up with observational studies that prove whatever they each want to say. The pro-mask people can get the pro-mask observational studies. The anti-mask people can get the anti-mask observational studies. But since I care about science and the truth, I'm not convinced by any of these studies. I don't know the answer. I strongly suspect the effect size is very small because we do have one glimpse, the randomized control trial in Bangladesh, which showed a very, very small effect size, even under sort of ideal conditions. They didn't have any vaccines and they didn't have any COVID at baseline, and they were adults. But that effect size is going to get smaller and smaller as you go to kids and you add in vaccination, you add in natural immunity, and you add in the fatigue that comes with prolonged use of anything. So I'm pretty confident the effect size is as close to 0 as possible, but I've always said from this entire pandemic that we ought to do cluster randomized controlled trials so that we can answer the question. Randomization solves the problem of too many people running too many analytic plans because it pre-specifies the analytic plan. We all agree to it, and then its answer may serve as the tiebreak for all of these studies. But what shocks me is we will leave this pandemic and we will not have done a single randomized control trial of masking in children. It's going to be one of the most debated issues. We may have masked hundreds and hundreds of millions of children for many, many months across the US and Europe and other parts of the world. Hundreds and hundreds of million, maybe even 1 billion children have been masked. And we will have no idea if that slowed COVID-19 spread and if by slowing that COVID-19 spread, we actually did them any good at all. Because the truth is, right now, seroprevalence in the United States is 90+%, and most of those kids got COVID prior to vaccination. So I'm not sure we helped them in any way by closing their schools and making them mask, even if it were the case that those things slowed spread, which it might not be the case. They might have just been expensive, costly theater. I don't know. Recently, there was a publication in a prestigious oncology journal, and it made the case that the timing of immunotherapy matters. It took a bunch of people who were receiving immunotherapy, and it looked to see when they got it, whether they got it early in the morning or they got it in the afternoon. And it claimed that if you got it late in the day, you had worse outcomes than if you got it early in the day. And this was something that spread like wildfire across the internet. People were so enamored by the idea, get your immunotherapy early. Their laboratory researchers who are pipetting all day, trying to see if the circadian rhythm and immunotherapy have some interaction, maybe through PD-1 expression or T-cell activation or blah, 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 blah. But nobody stopped to think the basic question, which is the people who get their immunotherapy bright and early in the morning are different than those who are getting it in the latter time slots. Why? Because like everything in life, there are coveted time slots and there are time slots that people don't like as much. And the coveted time spots, guess what? They go to rich, well-connected people. They go to people who are more medically savvy, who know how to work the system. That's where the coveted slots are going. And those tend to be the early bird time slots because you don't got to wait for anyone. You get in there, get out, you get your day going. Then there are time slots that are less desired. Those tend to be in the afternoon. They may go to people who are coming off a night shift, or people who have other challenges in their life that they got to deal with in the morning, or have difficulty getting out of bed in the morning, maybe because they're feeling sicker. And then there's always the situation in oncology where we really want to get someone to get the first dose, and we overbook them in clinic. They tend not to be the first coveted slot. They tend to be later in the day. So all of these are to suggest that there's more at play than just the timing of the infusion. There's also the type of person who will get an early bird infusion versus someone who'll get it later. Can this observational study sort that out? Answer, not at all. It's incapable of sorting it out. In fact, it's so bad, I wouldn't have even published it if I were the journal editor. I would say, this is not the kind of question that is amenable to observational techniques because you cannot control for unmeasured confounders. It's not even worth publishing. But not only is it published, it has sprung a little cottage industry of people who think that it's a real finding and they're trying to build their career around it. And we're spending money on funding laboratories that are studying circadian rhythm interaction with chemotherapy and all this. No one has thought to do the very simple study. You could do it in one hospital in 1 month. Just take the next 1,000 patients walking in the door and randomize them to a randomly assigned start time. We're not going to let you pick. We're just going to tell you, and then we're going to look to see if there's any difference in outcome of the next 1,000 people over the next 3 months in terms of overall survival, quality of life, or even patient satisfaction, depending on the time you're assigned. And we could look at all those endpoints. And I suspect what you'd find is that it doesn't matter. I suspect that this is mostly all driven by the types of people who get those early bird time slots and the types of people who unfortunately get the late in the day time slots, either because you really want them to get in there soon this week rather than next week, or because they don't have the sort of team it takes to navigate the healthcare space. And if that trial were negative, we could stop funding all these labs and stop funding all this garbage observational research, and we could save ourselves a lot of money. But we don't do that. Science, to me, it feels less like a project that wants to find the truth, because the randomized study is how you'll get the truth, and more like a jobs program for smart people who don't want to have a real job. I mean, we're going to take billions of dollars in federal money and fund all these labs to do all this useless research and these people to do useless retrospective chart review, and we're going to take that money and create this huge jobs program, and most people are going to do the sorts of studies that you could spend a whole career working on that a simple randomized trial could settle. We're going to get probably 1,000 studies on observational studies on masking kids. Think about how many person hours go into that 1,000 studies, maybe 100,000 person hours. And we could have answered the question in a simple cluster randomized trial. We chose not to do it. You know, I sometimes think back to the Middle Ages, not the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. I think back to the Renaissance, and I think back to those philanthropists who funded those great artists. And look what they created with all that art. That's beautiful art. And sometimes I see that in the modern world, people say, like, we should have some public funding of artists. And other people say, well, that's wasteful. You know, that's not a good use of taxpayer money. And what I want to say is I would rather fund 10 sculptors than one more VA ICD-10 code long COVID study. I'd rather fund 3 painters than one more observational studies of masks. I'd rather fund 4 performance artists than one more person who tries to look at the timing of chemotherapy in a retrospective data set. Somebody else was recently tweeting that we see a lot of database comparisons of cancer drugs. How did people do on a CAR T study versus how do they do in the database if they get treated with other products? You know these are useless, right? You know that if it were reliable, to make a reliable causal conclusion from this observational data, we wouldn't be running randomized trials, but we do because it isn't. And you also know the FDA is very invested in getting these observational data to yield useful results, so much so that they've contracted people like Sebastian Schniedelweiss from Harvard, but his Project Replicate, I believe it's called, has failed miserably because he can't seem to replicate more than half of the studies. If your best method, the target trial framework, can't replicate half of the studies, then what the hell are you doing? Why are you even doing this work, this causal observational work? I mean, if you cannot prove it has any validation external to your study, why are we sinking all this money into it? The answer is, of course, that it takes a certain amount of humility and buy-in to do randomized trials. People talk about what's the barrier. The barrier is money. The barrier is time. That's not the barrier. The barrier to doing the cluster randomized control trial of kids is that a lot of very prominent people, including Tony Fauci, went out there and said, you ought to do it, you ought to do it, you ought to do it. And the moment he said that, he can't allow a randomized study that could potentially contradict him. And in fact, he didn't allow it. People say he's a great scientist. What kind of scientist would make sweeping pandemic recommendations and run 0 cluster randomized trials? And people say, well, it's not in his purview. He's the guy who controls the funding. You do know that. He is literally the one person who could have made all of this happen, all of these studies happen. He didn't do it. That's not a good scientist in my mind. A good scientist uses randomization. They don't come up with reasons to say no to randomized studies. They don't keep whining about why we can't do it. They get it done. And I don't know what to think. I do think that we've always had this crisis. I mean, this is not new. 30, 40 years of biomedicine, we've always had a cottage industry of people who've had great careers chasing fantasies that turn out not to be true. The reason it's so prominent now is that some of these questions, I mean, obviously people have a strong emotional reaction to, as you might imagine, if you told them to mask their 2-year-old for years on end, they might have an emotional reaction to that. And the obligation of science is to generate credible data that shows whether or not it works, or if it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, you stop. If it does work, doesn't mean you do it. Then you start to weigh the trade-offs, the costs and benefits if it does work. We've not done any of that. The New England Journal of Medicine shouldn't have published this paper. I mean, to be honest, they're really failing. Because when I grew up and trained on the journal, I was trained in the idea that the journal only really publishes biomedical studies on treatments and interventions that are randomized studies. They're not in the observational business. That's changed in the pandemic. They love to publish observational studies that show the Biden policy on Paxlovid is right or boosters is right. Those studies have deep limitations to it. They love to publish masking. They're only publishing observational studies that fit a certain narrative. That's really going to undermine them in the long run. It's really going to sink their credibility. They don't see it yet, but very likely that, like so many things in life, the pendulum will swing on these issues. It's already swung dramatically on masking kids. I remember I was the one talking about it in 2021, how unpopular it was. Now, many more people are on my side, and in 2 more years, it's going to be thought of as a barbaric and foolish practice, I'm pretty confident. They're going to look bad, New England Journal. You don't want to be seen as an ideologic or political journal. You want to be seen as an arbiter of science. I don't think they are doing a good job at that. I didn't think they were doing it before. You can look at through my videos and my podcast on clinical trials on the journal that were flawed, but they're certainly not doing a good job now, and they're going to get a lot of attention. Ultimately, this masking paper ended with a line that said something to the effect that, mask mandates are a good way to correct for structural racism in systems. That to me blew me away because, of course, the 2 places in the study that continued the mask mandate were the places predominantly with Hispanic and Black students. They were inner city schools, whereas all the sort of more predominantly white suburban schools lifted the mandates earlier. And what they're saying is, but because it's low spread, it actually corrects for structural injustice because some groups of people are more likely to get COVID than other groups of people. I think it's very dangerous that we start to use masking kids, which is a scientific question, like does it work, as a proxy for sociopolitical debates. Similarly, you could argue it the exact opposite way, which is that if masking kids doesn't work, then it looks pretty bad that you're disproportionately masking Black and Hispanic kids who are in the urban center and not the suburban kids. That will look bad for you. But whether or not masking kids works or not is a scientific question that needs to be answered. Trying to conflate it as a political question, in my mind, is being done because the authors really want to turn this into a political debate, because it's much harder to try to defend this indefensible difference in difference analysis. It's a lot easier to say, well, you're a bad person. You're a bad person because you don't want to do this. And I think that's what a lot of people have tried to do throughout the pandemic. New England Journal of Medicine shouldn't have allowed that kind of rhetoric in their manuscript. They should have struck it out. Keep this focused on the issue. The issue is, does this slow spread? And there's 2 questions. Does implementing it slow the spread? And does removing it lead to a rise in spread? And also the deeper questions, which is, what is the value of slowing the spread? if you're going to end up in a situation several months later where you have 90% breakthrough. One arguable value is that if you allowed people a chance to get vaccinated or do something in the meantime, but as you see from statistics, people don't want to vaccinate their kids. You're at a third for, 5 to 11, and you're at, less than 10% for under 5. So why are we delaying something that's inevitable? If anything, you want to spread it out over time if no one's going to, take part in vaccination. And that's assuming that vaccination lowers severe disease and hospitalization, which I have not yet been persuaded by, because they haven't done the studies that are persuasive to me. They've done a Singapore study that's got different problems. Again, confounding. We're not going to get truth through observational studies on the pandemic. You're not going to get closer to the truth. You're just going to get two whole sets of literature. The solution was to agree upon randomized studies and run them. That was why I was a vocal proponent of randomization and remain so. Randomized trials were the only path forward. So those are my thoughts on science in general. I don't think it's doing well. I think it's doing quite poorly. This study is emblematic of that. Go to Sensible Medicine, read the point-by-point analysis by Tracy Beth Hogg. All right, if you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Until next time.